During this particular time of year, our collective focus usually shifts toward festive gatherings alongside our closest relatives and companions. King Charles has recently authorized an urgent decree that has transmitted tremors of disbelief throughout the royal residence and the legislative halls. An unearthing occurred during the pre-dawn hours of December 14th, which compelled the monarch to adopt unparalleled measures capable of restructuring the lineage and modifying the foundational legal structure itself. This singular event fundamentally alters the status quo. At 2:30 in the morning on December 14th, a high-ranking historian at Windsor Castle stumbled upon evidence that would spark the most critical constitutional urgency in contemporary British history. Helena Ashworth had been performing standard organizational tasks within the Royal Archives when she unsealed a container that had been incorrectly categorized and ignored for decades. The content she discovered inside would directly result in King Charles activating emergency authorities that had sat dormant for more than 100 years. The repository contained written communications and juridical papers spanning the years from 1902 through 1988. As Dr. Ashworth analyzed them with precision, she comprehended that she was viewing materials far more consequential than typical historical records. The files contained granular exchanges between top-tier courtiers, government bureaucrats, and legal counsels debating what seemed to be a synchronized attempt to engineer the protocols of succession. There were specific allusions to rectifying the lineage and guaranteeing suitable results while handling the predicament before it evolved into a liability. The phrasing utilized coded terminology, implying the authors were aware they were debating a matter that was dubious, likely illicit, and undeniably unconstitutional. Dr. Ashworth instantaneously grasped the magnitude of what she had uncovered. These records indicated an active plot at the zenith of the royal household and government to intervene in the constitutional transfer of the crown. At 3:15 that morning, she reached out to Sir Clive Alderton, who serves as the private secretary to the king. Sir Clive reached Windsor Castle in under 40 minutes, and by 5 a.m., King Charles was receiving a comprehensive briefing at Clarence House. The king dedicated the subsequent 6 hours to conferring with his most relied-upon aides, legal specialists, and scholars of the Constitution to scrutinize every single paper in the cache. They authenticated the legitimacy of the documents, cross-referenced the timelines and autographs, and validated the evidence against other established historical logs. By the early afternoon of December 14th, there remained no uncertainty that the files were legitimate, the signatures were real, and the ramifications were disastrous. Charles confronted a choice that required an instant resolution. He could suppress this revelation while leading a confidential inquiry, thereby shielding the reputation of the monarchy and evading immediate turmoil. However, this would involve withholding intelligence that potentially nullified core components of the succession, and it risked allegations of a cover-up should the data eventually surface. Conversely, Charles could take action right away, and with resolve by utilizing emergency powers to safeguard the files, initiate formal probes, and start assessing the total breadth and influence of the discovery. This approach would be forthright and constitutionally sound. Yet it would also ignite an instant crisis, fierce media examination, and public skepticism regarding the validity of the monarchy. Charles elected to pursue the second option. By 6 o'clock in the evening on December 14th, he had affixed his signature to an emergency decree invoking royal prerogative authorities that had remained dormant since the era of King George VI during the Second World War. The mandate placed the unearthed bouts under a formal seal, designated a specialized tribunal to explore their substance and consequences, and necessitated the immediate briefing of the Prime Minister and top parliamentary figures. The choice to move with such speed was motivated partially by Charles's dedication to openness and constitutional correctness, but it was also propelled by a more pressing factor. There was proof within the files themselves that specific people were aware of the scheme and had been operating for years to guarantee the materials remained lost. There were recent inclusions in the archive, documents from as recently as 2022, implying that whatever plot had started decades ago was still operational, still being directed, and still impacting present-day functions within the royal household. Within hours of Charles ratifying the order, security measures at the palace were implemented immediately. The royal archives situated at Windsor Castle were placed on lockdown with armed guards stationed at the perimeter. Every staff member who possessed entry privileges to the zone where the files were located was placed on administrative suspension awaiting interrogation. Electronic and physical logs pertaining to succession strategy from 1970 onward were taken into custody. By December 2nd, the emergency decree had been fully enacted. The inquiry was officially in motion, and Charles had reached the conclusion to offer a restricted revelation to the general population. A cautiously drafted announcement from Buckingham Palace declared that historical papers prompting inquiries into previous administrative habits had been located, and the king had mandated a comprehensive probe to establish the truth and execute suitable measures. What Charles had found was substantiation of a scheme that attacked the very core of the constitutional monarchy, specifically the regulations and protocols dictating who inherits the crown. The emergency decree he signed marked the commencement of a procedure that could either fortify the monarchy by revealing and rectifying past injustices, or potentially dismantle it if the complete truth turned out to be too destructive for the establishment to endure. The document that King Charles executed on the evening of December 14th was unparalleled in its breadth and noteworthy for its utilization of powers that most experts on the Constitution surmised had been effectively defunct for decades. The emergency decree, formally labeled a royal warrant of special authority, relied on the monarch's reserve capabilities, those constitutional rights that exist in theory but are virtually never practiced in reality. The decree was comprised of 5 primary instructions, each meticulously designed by constitutional attorneys to guarantee validity while managing the pressing emergency. The initial instruction enacted immediate protective guardianship over all documents, materials, and logs associated with succession strategy and royal household management from 1970 to the current day. Archives located at Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and other royal estates were to be locked down with access limited to specifically cleared investigators. This first instruction was vital because the discovered papers alluded to other evidence and supporting logs that had been intentionally segregated and concealed in various locations. By securing everything without delay, the order forestalled the annihilation or extraction of proof that might be essential to comprehending the full extent of what had transpired. The second instruction created a Royal Commission of Inquiry, endowed with exceptional investigative liberties. This was an official constitutional tool that granted the Commission the right to mandate testimony, subpoena files, and view restricted government logs. The Commission was to be staffed by 3 high-ranking judges, 2 experts on the Constitution, and 1 historian with a specialty in 20th century royal matters. All were selected for their autonomy and trustworthiness. The creation of this commission was legally contentious. Some scholars of the Constitution contended that the monarch lacked the unilateral right to establish such an entity without the consent of Parliament. However, Charles's legal team had concluded that in instances regarding the integrity of the succession itself, which is the core constitutional duty of the monarchy, the sovereign maintained reserve powers to probe threats against that system. The third instruction necessitated prompt notification and deliberation with the Prime Minister, the Lord Chancellor, and the heads of all significant political factions. This was a constitutional necessity. Whatever the probe revealed would carry consequences for Parliament's function in succession statutes, potentially necessitating legislative maneuvers. By integrating political leaders into the operation immediately, Charles was guaranteeing that his moves could not be depicted as the monarch acting unilaterally on constitutional issues. The fourth instruction was perhaps the most personally challenging for Charles. It necessitated the suspension of specific high-ranking royal household officers, pending the result of the inquiry. These were people who had worked for the monarchy for decades, some of whom Charles knew intimately and relied upon. However, the documents contained citations of household roles and duties suggesting that the current staff might possess awareness of or complicity in obscuring the initial plot. Charles, of course, could not permit personal allegiance to hinder the pursuit of the truth. The suspended officers were handled with dignity, placed on paid leave, not publicly indicted, and granted access to legal counsel, but they were extracted from roles where they might have the capacity to sway the investigation or eliminate further evidence. The fifth and final instruction tackled the issue of succession itself. During the investigative phase, Charles proclaimed that while the inquiry was in progress, the established sequence of heirs would continue to function as standard. William stayed as the heir, George remained second in line, and so on. Yet, Charles also articulated that if the inquiry brought to light information that substantively impacted the validity of the succession, he would collaborate with Parliament to manage those findings properly, even if doing so necessitated constitutional reformation. This statement was vital because it forestalled an immediate meltdown, while admitting the feasibility of eventual repercussions. Charles was communicating that the monarchy would keep operating normally, but that he would not preserve the institution's stability by suppressing findings that weakened its legitimacy. If the inquiry showed that the succession had been manipulated illicitly, those manipulations would be rectified regardless of the toll on the monarchy's standing. Constitutional specialists were split on whether Charles had genuinely operated within his rights or had exceeded his bounds. Some posited that this was precisely the sort of scenario the reserve powers were intended for, representing a foundational threat to the constitutional order that demanded instant measures. Others were anxious that Charles had established a perilous precedent. However, Charles had finalized his selection. He had executed the emergency decree, and now the apparatus of investigation and questioning was active. Charles had guaranteed that whatever occurred subsequently would take place in the public eye through constitutional channels with openness and validity. What Charles had authorized was not a seizure of power, but an endeavor to utilize the monarch's constitutional function as the protector of the succession to manage a crisis that struck at the core of the monarchy's legitimacy. As the Royal Commission commenced its tasks, and as reliable investigators scrutinized the discovered files in depth, the full extent of what had been concealed for decades began to materialize. What they uncovered was more vast, more premeditated, and more unsettling than even Charles's preliminary review had indicated. This was not a mere clerical mistake or a trivial violation of protocol. This was a synchronized plot involving dozens of people across numerous institutions, crafted to engineer the succession in ways that transgressed constitutional tenets and potentially criminal statutes. The plot commenced in 1972, although its origins extended back to frictions accumulating within the royal household and government throughout the 1960s. At that juncture, there were profound worries among specific senior courtiers and establishment figures regarding the trajectory the monarchy might adopt in future generations. These anxieties focused on perceived deficiencies in the character or fitness of certain individuals within or near the line of inheritance. The papers disclosed that a faction of senior household officials, collaborating with sympathetic figures in the Home Office and the Lord Chancellor's office, constructed what they termed a succession security protocol. The phrasing was intentionally bureaucratic and nondescript, designed to make their operations sound like standard administrative scheduling. But what they were truly doing was establishing mechanisms to dictate who would and would not be positioned to inherit the crown. The specific techniques differed but encompassed several distinct tactics. First, there was the distortion of intelligence provided to the monarch regarding various family members. Dossiers on the character, aptitudes, and fitness of potential heirs were selectively redacted to highlight negatives about individuals the conspirators deemed troublesome and to minimize worries about those they preferred. This information warfare was nuanced but potent, molding perceptions and choices over time. Second, there was interference with matrimony and personal partnerships. The documents contained letters regarding the encouragement or dissuasion of specific romantic bonds, providing leaks to the press that would harm particular relationships and manufacturing circumstances that would push individuals toward or away from specific choices. The objective was to dictate which family members produced as offspring and when, thereby impacting the succession order without outwardly violating succession statutes. Third, and most alarmingly, there was direct manipulation of legal and bureaucratic procedures connected to succession. This involved modifying or burying documents related to births, marriages, and questions of legitimacy. It involved offering dubious legal counsel designed to steer succession-related choices in preferred directions, and in at least two instances documented in the papers, it involved active endeavors to hide information regarding potential claimants to succession rights who were perceived as unsuitable by the plotters. The names implicated in these files include several Lord Chamberlains who served during the 1970s and 80s, at least 3 private secretaries to the monarch, multiple senior civil servants in relevant government bureaus, and a small cadre of trusted legal advisors who supplied the intellectual structure and rationale for the plot. These were not rogue operators or fringe characters. They were pillars of the establishment, individuals entrusted with the most delicate responsibilities in royal and governmental matters. Their incentives, as revealed in the correspondence, were multifaceted. Some genuinely believed they were safeguarding the monarchy from individuals who would damage it through poor judgment or scandal. Others were driven by class bias, worried about marriages to people they deemed insufficiently aristocratic, or concerns about family members with progressive political leanings. And some appeared propelled by simple elitism, a conviction that they comprehended better than anyone else, including the monarch and the public who should and should not wear the crown. The plot functioned through a network of trusted operatives who convened regularly, communicated through secure avenues, and maintained rigid secrecy regarding their operations. They referred to themselves in correspondence as the Committee for Constitutional Continuity, a label that made their actions sound official and sanctioned when, in reality, they possessed no legitimate mandate for what they were doing. What makes the plot particularly stunning is how long it functioned and how successfully it remained obscured. Documents in the collection span from 1902 to 1988, suggesting 16 years of active manipulation. However, there are mentions in later materials to the understanding and the protocols being preserved, suggesting that even after the original conspirators retired or passed away, their successors continued implementing the systems that had been founded. The sealed container that Dr. Ashworth located in December 2024 was apparently created as part of an evidence-securing process. Someone in the conspiracy had amassed the most incriminating papers, the ones that explicitly discussed manipulation and plotting, and sealed them away, mislabeling the container to guarantee it would not be opened during standard archival work. The strategy appears to have been for the evidence to remain hidden permanently, or, at a minimum, until everyone involved was deceased and prosecution was no longer feasible. But they committed an error. They did not destroy the documents, possibly because doing so would have required multiple people to be cognizant of the destruction and would have heightened the risk of exposure. Instead, they concealed the materials and hoped they would never be located. And for 36 years, that gamble succeeded until a standard cataloging project and a diligent archivist brought everything into the light. What is already manifest is that the conspiracy transgressed fundamental constitutional principles. The succession to the British throne is governed by statute. A group of unelected courtiers and civil servants, no matter how well-intentioned they believed themselves to be, possessed no authority to manipulate that succession through covert activities and information warfare. Their actions represented a profound violation of trust. They were charged with serving the monarchy and the Constitution, and instead, they subverted both in service of their own views regarding who should rule, and they did it in secret, without accountability, without democratic oversight, in ways that violated both the spirit and potentially the letter of British constitutional law. King Charles, reading through these documents, reportedly expressed both fury and deep sorrow. Fury at the betrayal, at the arrogance of individuals who thought they had the right to engineer succession, but sorrow, too, because some of these conspirators were people his parents had trusted, people who had served the monarchy faithfully in other respects, people whose loyalty had been assumed but had proved conditional and self-serving. The revelation of this plot has forced a reckoning not just with specific past actions, but with the entire system of courtiers, private secretaries, and elected advisors who wield significant power within the monarchy. If such a plot could operate for 16 years without detection, what does that say about accountability and oversight within the royal household? These are questions that Charles's emergency order has forced into the open. The constitutional crisis created by the discovery of this conspiracy goes far beyond historical scandal or questions about long-dead courtiers. It strikes directly at the fundamental question that underpins constitutional monarchy. Is the succession legitimate? This question, once raised, cannot be easily dismissed or answered without profound investigation and potential consequences that reach all the way to the present line of succession. The British monarchy's authority rests on constitutional legitimacy. The monarch reigns not through power or coercion, but through acceptance by Parliament and people that the succession operates according to established law. If that succession has been manipulated, if unlawful interference has affected who sits on the throne or who is in line to inherit it, then the entire constitutional foundation is called into question. The specific threat to current succession comes from several different angles. First, there is the question of whether any of the conspiracy's actions actually succeeded in changing outcomes. The documents include references to specific individuals being managed and specific situations being resolved in ways that affected positioning in the succession. If any of these interventions actually worked, if someone who should have been in the line of succession was excluded, or if someone's position was altered through manipulation, then current succession arrangements might be based on those past manipulations. The Royal Commission is currently investigating several specific cases that appear in the documents. One involves a family member in the 1970s whose marriage was apparently discouraged through a coordinated campaign of negative publicity and family pressure. That individual eventually married someone else, had different children, and those children's positions in succession were affected by the timing and circumstances of their parents' relationship. If the original interference was unlawful, does it affect the legitimacy of current succession arrangements? Another case involves questions about documentation related to a birth in the 1980s. The conspiracy documents include references to managing paperwork and ensuring appropriate recording in ways that suggest potential manipulation of official records. If birth documentation was altered or suppressed, and if that documentation affected someone's claim to or position in succession, then current arrangements might be based on fraudulent information. The constitutional experts advising Charles and the Royal Commission are divided on how to interpret these situations. Some argue that even if past manipulations occurred, they cannot be undone now. They claim that succession is a matter of settled fact, that the current line has been accepted by Parliament through multiple acts, and that reopening questions from decades ago would create impossible legal and constitutional tangles. But others argue that constitutional legitimacy cannot be based on settled facts if those facts were produced by unlawful manipulation. If the succession was corrupted, then it must be corrected, regardless of how difficult or disruptive that correction might be. To do otherwise would be to accept that powerful individuals can manipulate constitutional processes with impunity, as long as they succeed in hiding their actions long enough. The threat to Prince William and his children is particularly concerning. William is currently first in line to the throne, and George, Charlotte, and Louis follow him in succession order. Their positions are based on William's birth as the first son of Charles and Diana, and on the succession to the Crown Act 20, which ended male primogeniture. But if any aspect of the succession in previous generations was affected by the conspiracy, if Charles's own position or the positions of other family members were manipulated, does that create questions about William's legitimacy as heir? The legal argument is complex. William's position is based on statute law passed by Parliament, and statute law generally cannot be invalidated by showing that historical events leading to its passage were affected by private manipulation. But constitutional law is not purely statutory. It includes common law principles, constitutional conventions, and fundamental concepts of legitimacy that go beyond what is written in legislation. If the monarchy's constitutional legitimacy depends on succession operating according to law and custom, and if that succession was secretly manipulated in violation of law and custom, then arguably the entire structure is compromised. Not because William himself did anything wrong, he is entirely innocent of any conspiracy, but because the system that placed him in his position may have been corrupted. This is why Charles' emergency order was necessary, and why it required immediate action. The longer questions about succession legitimacy remain unresolved, the more they undermine confidence in the monarchy itself. Every decision the monarch makes, every constitutional function performed, carries an implicit claim to legitimate authority. If that legitimacy is genuinely in question, the entire system is destabilized. Parliament was briefed on these concerns in emergency sessions on December 15th and 6th. According to sources who attended, the atmosphere was tense and worried. Members of Parliament recognized that they might face a situation with no good options. Either accept that the succession was manipulated and take steps to correct it, potentially creating massive disruption, or effectively endorse the manipulation by declining to investigate its full impact. Some MPs argued that the stability of constitutional government required it accepting current arrangements regardless of how they came about. Better to move forward than to reopen questions that could destabilize the entire system. But others insisted that legitimacy matters, that constitutional government cannot be based on accepting unlawful manipulation, and that however difficult the investigation might be, it was necessary. The Prime Minister, in a carefully worded statement to Parliament, supported King Charles's emergency order and the Royal Commission's investigation. The statement emphasized that no conclusions had been reached about impacts on current succession, but that the questions raised by the discovery were serious enough to require a thorough investigation. The statement also noted that Parliament would need to be involved in addressing any findings that affected the succession law or constitutional arrangements. What makes this crisis particularly acute is that there is no clear precedent for how to handle it. British constitutional history includes various succession disputes and irregular successions, but nothing quite like evidence of a sustained conspiracy by royal advisers to manipulate the line of succession through secret activities. The constitutional machinery for addressing this situation simply does not exist in clear form. Charles and his advisers are essentially creating the process as they go, trying to balance several competing imperatives. They need to uncover the full truth about what happened and what its impacts were. They need to preserve constitutional stability and avoid unnecessary disruption. They need to maintain public confidence in the monarchy, and they need to ensure that any corrective actions are legitimate, lawful, and constitutionally sound. The worst-case scenario is that the investigation reveals manipulations that materially affected current succession, requiring constitutional reform that calls into question William's position as heir or that creates alternative claims to succession rights. This would trigger a constitutional crisis of unprecedented scope, potentially requiring new legislation, possibly even raising questions about whether the monarchy itself could survive such a revelation. The best-case scenario is that the investigation reveals that, despite the conspiracy's intentions and activities, it did not actually succeed in changing succession outcomes, that the line of succession would have been the same regardless of the manipulation. This would allow the conspiracy to be acknowledged, condemned, and addressed through reforms without requiring any changes to current succession arrangements. But the investigation has not yet reached conclusions about which scenario is accurate. And until it does, the entire question of succession legitimacy remains open, creating uncertainty that affects not just the royal family, but the broader constitutional system. Charles's emergency order has forced these questions into the open, and now they must be answered, whatever the consequences. What makes the discovery in Charles's emergency response even more urgent is evidence that the conspiracy was not entirely historical, that efforts to hide the truth have continued into the present, and that certain individuals have been working to prevent exactly the kind of disclosure that occurred in December 2024. The documents that Dr. Ashworth found included materials dated as recently as 22, suggesting active efforts to maintain secrecy and to manage risks of discovery. Within the sealed container were several memoranda written in the past 5 years by individuals whose identities are being protected pending the investigation. These recent documents discussed legacy management and maintaining historical consistency in ways that made clear the writers knew about the original conspiracy and were working to ensure it remained hidden. They referenced specific archival materials that needed to be secured, specific individuals who might have dangerous knowledge, and specific scenarios that could lead to unwanted disclosure. Most alarmingly, the recent documents included discussion of the exact cataloging project that ultimately led to the discovery. Someone within the royal household knew that the systematic archival work being conducted could potentially uncover the sealed container. The memoranda discussed ways to delay or redirect the cataloging project to ensure that specific areas of the archives were left for later review, or to have trusted individuals conduct the work in sensitive areas, rather than allowing general archival staff access. These efforts apparently failed because Dr. Ashworth was conducting the work on an accelerated schedule due to staffing issues, and because the mislabeling of the container meant that even people who might have been watching for it did not recognize it when it appeared in the cataloging records. The discovery was accidental from the perspective of the cover-up, but it was also somewhat inevitable given the thoroughness of modern archival practices. Once Charles signed his emergency order, those who had been managing the cover-up faced a critical decision. They could come forward, cooperate with the investigation, and hope for lenient treatment based on their disclosure, or they could continue attempting to hide their involvement and to minimize the damage from what had been revealed. The evidence suggests that at least some chose the latter course. In the 72 hours after the emergency order was executed, there were several suspicious incidents. Computer systems containing personnel records from the relevant historical periods experienced unexplained crashes that required restoration from backups. Several former household officials who had served during the conspiracy years could not be located for initial interviews, having apparently left their usual residences suddenly, and there was an attempted break-in at the National Archives facility, where certain government records related to royal household administration are stored. Palace security and the investigators Charles appointed took these incidents seriously. The computer crashes were analyzed by digital forensics experts who determined that they appeared to be deliberate sabotage rather than random technical failures. The missing former officials were located through more intensive efforts, with assistance from police and security at all facilities containing relevant records was dramatically increased. What became clear was that there were still individuals who had a stake in preventing the full truth from emerging. These might include people who had participated in the original conspiracy and feared prosecution or disgrace. They might include individuals who had knowledge of the conspiracy and failed to report it, making them potential accessories after the fact. Or they might include people in positions of current power who feared that full disclosure would expose their own negligence or complicity in maintaining the cover-up. Charles was reportedly furious when informed about these interference attempts. He had specifically designed his emergency order to be transparent and constitutionally appropriate, to investigate the conspiracy through proper legal channels rather than through secretive royal prerogative. But the attempts at cover-up and evidence destruction suggested that some individuals still believed they could operate outside the law, that their positions gave them immunity from accountability. In response, Charles expanded the emergency order to include additional security measures and to give investigators more explicit authority to pursue evidence of ongoing conspiracy or cover-up. He also authorized cooperation with law enforcement, making clear that if the investigation uncovered evidence of criminal activity, whether historical or ongoing, it would be referred to appropriate authorities for prosecution. This decision was significant because it meant Charles was willing to see people prosecuted, potentially including individuals who had served the monarchy faithfully in other respects. He was choosing truth and accountability over institutional loyalty, sending a message that the conspiracy and its cover-up were serious enough to warrant criminal consequences. The motivation behind the cover-up attempts appears to be multifaceted. For some, it is clearly about avoiding personal consequences, prosecution, disgrace, loss of honors, or pensions. For others, it seems to be about protecting the monarchy's reputation based on a belief that public knowledge of the conspiracy would damage the institution irreparably. And for some, it may be about protecting powerful individuals or institutions whose complicity in the conspiracy would be revealed by full investigation. The documents include references to government departments, legal firms, and even media organizations that apparently had some knowledge of or involvement in the conspiracy or its cover-up. Full investigation threatens to expose not just royal household failings, but broader establishment complicity in manipulating constitutional processes. This makes the cover-up attempts more than just personal self-preservation. They are about protecting an entire network of elite power that operated outside democratic accountability. Charles's decision to push forward despite these cover-up attempts reflects his recognition that half measures would be worse than full disclosure. If the investigation was seen as a limited hangout, an effort to acknowledge some wrongdoing while hiding the full extent, it would fail to restore confidence and would leave the monarchy vulnerable to future revelations. Better to uncover everything now, take whatever consequences follow, and rebuild on a foundation of transparency. The race against time is real because evidence can be destroyed, memories can fade or be conveniently forgotten, and witnesses can be pressured toward into silence. Every day that passes increases the risk that critical information will be lost. This is why Charles acted so quickly. After the initial discovery, why he used emergency powers rather than standard procedures, and why he has been willing to expand the investigation even when doing so risks uncovering more damaging information. Sources close to the investigation report that several individuals have come forward voluntarily with additional information since the emergency order was executed. These are people who had knowledge of aspects of the conspiracy or cover-up, but who had remained silent out of fear or misguided loyalty. Charles's decisive action apparently convinced them that silence was no longer tenable, that the truth was coming out regardless, and that cooperation offered their best hope for fair treatment. These voluntary disclosures have provided investigators with leads that are expanding the scope of what is being examined. The conspiracy appears to have been even more extensive than the initial document suggested, involving more people and more institutions over a longer period. Each new disclosure raises additional questions and creates new investigative threads to follow. But the disclosures also provide hope that the full truth can be uncovered despite the cover-up attempts. The conspiracy remained hidden for decades, largely because so few people knew about it, and those who did kept silent. Now that silence is breaking, the information is flowing, and the picture is becoming clearer. Charlie's emergency order has created momentum toward disclosure that appears to be overcoming the forces working to maintain secrecy. The battle between investigation and cover-up continues, but Charles has made clear which side he is on. He will support the investigation wherever it leads, protect witnesses and whistleblowers who come forward, and prosecute those who continue attempting to hide the truth. It is a high-stakes gamble. Full disclosure might reveal information that damages the monarchy beyond repair. But Charles has calculated that the monarchy's only hope for long-term survival is to face this crisis with complete honesty, accepting whatever consequences follow from the truth. King Charles's emergency order has set in motion a process whose endpoint remains uncertain, but whose journey will fundamentally reshape the British monarchy and potentially the broader constitutional framework. In the immediate term, the investigation will continue for months, possibly years, as the Royal Commission examines evidence, interviews witnesses, and pieces together the full story of what occurred. But beyond the investigation itself, Charles's decision to confront this crisis head-on has already begun changing how the monarchy operates and how it is perceived. The immediate legal proceedings are extensive. The Royal Commission has established several working groups, each focused on different aspects of the conspiracy. One group is examining the historical documents to establish a complete timeline of what occurred, who was involved, and what actions were taken. Another is investigating whether any of the conspiracy's activities actually succeeded in changing succession outcomes. A third is looking at the cover-up, identifying who knew about the conspiracy afterward and what they did to hide it. Each working group has authority to compel testimony and documents. Former household officials, retired civil servants, and even some current staff have been or will be interviewed under oath. Archives are being examined line by line. Computer systems are being forensically analyzed for deleted files or hidden communications. It is an exhaustive process, but Charles and the Commission leadership have made clear that thoroughness is more important than speed. In parallel with the Royal Commission's work, criminal investigations have been launched. The Metropolitan Police and the Crown Prosecution Service are examining whether the conspiracy and cover-up have involved criminal offenses. Potential charges being considered include misconduct in public office, conspiracy to defraud, and perverting the course of justice. These are serious crimes carrying substantial penalties, and the investigations are being conducted with appropriate gravity. The decision to pursue criminal charges is controversial. Some argue that the passage of time, the death of many original conspirators, and the complexity of proving criminal intent make prosecution impractical, and that resources would be better spent on reforming systems to prevent future conspiracies. Others insist that without criminal accountability, The message sent would be that establishment figures can violate the law with impunity, as long as they maintain secrecy long enough. Charles has left the decision about criminal prosecutions to appropriate authorities, making clear that he will not interfere but will support whatever legally justified actions are taken. This is consistent with his overall approach: transparency, adherence to proper legal processes, and refusal to use royal influence to protect individuals or institutions at the expense of truth. The question of how this discovery affects public trust in the monarchy is already being tested. Initial polling conducted after the limited public disclosure showed mixed results. Approximately 42% of respondents said the discovery made them question the monarchy's legitimacy, while 38% said they appreciated Charles's transparency in addressing the issue, and 20% remained undecided or unaware of the situation. These numbers will likely shift as more information emerges. If the investigation reveals that the conspiracy successfully manipulated succession in ways that affect current arrangements, public confidence could collapse. But if the investigation shows that despite the conspiracy's intentions, it did not actually change outcomes, and if Charles's handling of the crisis is seen as appropriate and honest, the monarchy might emerge with enhanced credibility based on its willingness to confront difficult truths. The impact on William and his family is a matter of deep concern to Charles. The Prince of Wales has been briefed on the discovery and the investigation, and sources describe him as shocked but supportive of his father's decision to investigate fully. William understands that his own position could potentially be called into question depending on what is uncovered, but he has reportedly told Charles that truth matters more than protecting his personal interests. This response is characteristic of William's evolving approach to his role. He has been shaped by watching his mother struggle with and eventually expose dysfunctions within the monarchy. He has learned from his father's years of frustration as heir, a parent dealing with an institution resistant to change. William appears to have concluded that the monarchy's survival depends on its willingness to reform, to be transparent, and to place constitutional legitimacy above institutional self-preservation. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, the long-term implications remain uncertain. They are being raised by parents who are determined to give them as normal a childhood as possible while preparing them for potential royal roles. But the constitutional uncertainty created by this investigation adds another layer of complexity. Their parents cannot tell them with absolute certainty what their futures will hold, because that depends partly on what the investigation reveals about whether the succession has been compromised. The question of whether the monarchy can survive this revelation is not hyperbolic. Public support for the monarchy has been declining gradually over recent decades, particularly among younger Britons. The discovery of a decades-long conspiracy to manipulate succession could accelerate that decline, particularly if the conspiracy is seen as emblematic of broader problems with unaccountable power and elite manipulation. But there's also a scenario in which the monarchy emerges strengthened. If Charles's handling of the crisis demonstrates that the modern monarchy is willing to be transparent, to hold itself accountable, to address past wrongs honestly, rather than covering them up, then the institution might gain credibility precisely because it confronted difficult truths. The monarchy's survival has always depended on adaptation, on evolving to meet changing circumstances while maintaining core constitutional functions. This crisis could be another moment of necessary evolution. The broader constitutional implications are significant. Parliament will need to be involved in addressing whatever the investigation reveals, particularly if changes to succession law or constitutional arrangements are required. This will force a national conversation about what the monarchy is for, how it should operate, and what reforms are needed to ensure it serves democratic values while maintaining its constitutional role. Some constitutional experts are advocating for using this crisis as an opportunity for comprehensive reform. They argue for codifying the monarchy's powers and functions in a written constitution, for creating formal oversight mechanisms for the royal household, for establishing clear accountability structures that would prevent future conspiracies. Others warn against overreacting to a historical conspiracy by imposing rigid rules that might impair the monarchy's ability to function effectively in its ceremonial and constitutional roles. What is already clear is that the days of the royal household, operating with minimal external oversight, are ending. Charles's emergency order and the subsequent investigation have exposed vulnerabilities in how the monarchy is administered. Reforms will be necessary to rebuild trust, and those reforms will likely include greater transparency, formal accountability mechanisms, and clearer boundaries around what royal advisors and household officials can and cannot do. The next several years will be critical for the monarchy's future. As the investigation proceeds, as findings emerge, as decisions are made about how to address whatever is uncovered, each step will affect public confidence and constitutional stability. Charles has set the monarchy on a path of radical transparency, accepting that this approach carries risks, but believing that the alternative, attempting to hide or minimize the conspiracy, would be ultimately more damaging. In conversations with close advisors, Charles has reportedly expressed a clear philosophy about this crisis. He believes that the monarchy exists to serve the nation, not to protect its own interests at the nation's expense. If full disclosure of the conspiracy and its impacts leads to constitutional reform, or even to questions about whether the monarchy should continue to exist, then those are questions that deserve to be asked and answered honestly. The monarchy has no right to survival if its legitimacy is based on covered-up manipulation rather than genuine constitutional authority. This is a remarkable position for a monarch to take, essentially saying that truth matters more than institutional self-preservation. But it is consistent with Charles's character and his long-stated commitment to service rather than privilege. He waited 73 years to become king. He is not going to spend his reign hiding uncomfortable truths to protect an institution that might not deserve protection if those truths reveal fundamental corruption. The emergency order that King Charles signed was just the beginning. The investigation it launched will continue. The truth will emerge, and when it does, Britain will face decisions about its constitutional future that have implications far beyond the royal family. This is not just about correcting historical wrongs. It is about determining what kind of monarchy, if any, the nation wants for the future. Charles has forced that question into the open, and now it must be answered.